Though not mentioned by name in Revelation, the Antichrist has come to be a central figure of the apocalypse. One of its earliest depictions comes from the time of the Crusades, drawn by the German nun Hildegard of Bingen.
Hildegard of Bingen is one of the most interesting figures in the whole history of apocalypticism. Very brilliant, a very talented, multi-talented woman, and a deep believer in Bible prophecy.
Hildegard wrote this music, painted these pictures, and had powerful apocalyptic visions.
One of Hildegard's most dramatic visions is the one where she describes the actual birth of the Antichrist figure. And it is indeed a monstrous birth.
In her vagina there appeared a monstrous and totally black head with fiery eyes, ears like the ears of a donkey, nostrils and mouth like those of a lion, gnashing with vast open mouth.
That, of course, is the image of the Antichrist who will be born from the church, who will persecute believing Christians, and who will try to pretend that he is divine by ascending into heaven.
For Hildegard, the source of the Antichrist's evil power lay in Judaism.
The Antichrist orders them to observe both circumcision and Judaism, according to the customs of the Jews.
I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that she uses a great deal of earlier medieval Christian anti-Jewish legend and thinking. For her, it's very clear that the Jews are the enemy of Christ.
Each year, the town of Trier, Germany, celebrates the first day of Pentecost with a procession. On this day in 1096, Crusaders arrived in Trier on their way to Jerusalem.
When the Crusades were getting underway and Christians were going off to Jerusalem to redeem the city of Jerusalem from the heretics, at the same time we see horrible, horrendous anti-Semitic persecutions breaking out in some of the cities of Germany.
Pope Urban had envisioned a crusade of knightly warriors fueled by religious spirit. But what began as a holy mission turned into apocalyptic mob violence.
These hordes felt that as a necessary preliminary to the second coming, it was necessary to kill all Jews. This was not the official church doctrine. The official doctrine was that all Jews must be converted to Christianity before the second coming. But one way of settling this matter was to kill them. Then there would be no unconverted Jews left.
The Crusaders killed thousands of Jews in the towns along the Rhine. Their deaths were marked by the singing of the ancient prayer of grief over the destruction of the temple.
This anti-Jewish sentiment had, of course, been around for several centuries prior to Hildegard. But with the beginning of the Crusades, we get the first mass killing of Jews as a part of a Christian holy war. That, combined with the sense of this apocalyptic adventure, is really going to kick off for us 1,000 years of anti-Semitism.
Through the ages, the dualism of apocalypse, light and dark, good and evil, has fueled hatred and violence. But for some, it has also infused historic events with prophetic meaning. Perhaps the most far-reaching interpretation of the Bible as a blueprint for history stems from the 12th century Italian monk Joachim of Fiore. At the monastery in Casamare, south of Rome, Joachim would change the course of Christian apocalyptic thinking.
Joachim of Fiore is the most important apocalyptic thinker of the whole medieval period. And maybe after the prophet John, the most important apocalyptic thinker in the history of Christianity. He tells us that he was trying to understand and write a commentary on the book of Revelation, and finding it impossible. The book was too difficult. And then one Easter morning he awakened, but he awakened as a new person, having been given a spiritual understanding of the meaning of the book of Revelation and the concords, that is, the relationship of all the books in the Bible.
Joachim began a long tradition of biblical prophecy by expressing his predictions of history in a series of charts. He tied the meaning of history directly to the Holy Trinity.
The first is the age of the Father. He links it to the period of ancient Israel. The second is the age of the Son. It's the period of the church from the New Testament down to his own time. The third age, the one that's just about to dawn, he calls the age of the Spirit. It's the age when the whole world will be at peace and the whole world will look like and live like a monastery.
Joachim's vision of the third age was peaceful. It was a spiritual age. It would be a purification of the world through the existence and the influence of a monastic order, which would be totally spiritual, totally pure.
And yet, Joachim's vision was a radical departure. He rejected the official church view that Christ's return lay somewhere off in the distant future. In the midst of the Crusades, he predicted that Armageddon was near.
Joachim put himself effectively in opposition to the Catholic hierarchy. He triggered a sense of hope that the age of the Spirit was indeed about to begin, and that the old corrupt order would be overthrown.
Joachim was a real apocalypticist in the original sense of the prophet John, because he believed that current events that he saw around him were signs of the times, signs that had been predicted in the book of the Apocalypse and now were being fulfilled. This is what Augustine and others had ruled out.
Joachim illustrated the beast of Revelation with its 7 heads representing kings who have oppressed Christianity. The first head is Herod the Great. The 6th head is Saladin, the Turkish leader who had repulsed the Crusaders and now controlled Jerusalem.
He believed that Saladin was the current persecutor and that right around the corner would be the 7th head, who would be the final historical Antichrist.
Joachim also turned to Revelation to tell him how long till the end.
He comes up with a numerical calculation by reading scripture and figuring out how to put the numbers together. By the time he totals it all up, he comes to the conclusion that from the birth of Christ to the end of time is 1,260 years.
The date he settled on, 1260, lay only 80 years in the future.
It's an immensely complicated numerological fantasy which led him to the year 1260. Also, of course, he would be conveniently dead before that, which indeed he was.
The most striking example of apocalyptic art from the Middle Ages are Signorelli's frescoes in the cathedral at Orvieto, Italy.
This is the story of the end of the world. This is the story of the apocalypse. All what will happen before, during, and after the end. So the story starts from the preaching of the Antichrist. And you see on this side, we can see a man looking like Jesus.
But it's not Jesus. Signorelli's is the first known depiction of Antichrist as a deceptively Christ-like figure.
And as we see this face, which is a demonic parody of the face of Christ, with all the features of the traditional portrayal of Christ, but somehow, in the genius of Signorelli's art, made into an image of evil.
One fresco depicts the fate of true believers.
And the idea, of course, is the great idea of hope, that those who have lived according to the Christian gospel will be called up to participate with Christ in eternal glory.
On this side of the arch is going on really the end of the humanity. And look how amazing. Isn't that amazing, painted 500 years ago? You see, the laser rays will destroy the humanity. This is like Star Wars, huh?
But art like Signorelli's came at enormous cost. To pay for it, the church sold indulgences, certificates that offered the buyer a better afterlife.
In fact, the church has left us with some of the great treasures of medieval art through money that in part was raised by indulgences.
In the year 1517, convinced that indulgences were a symptom of a profoundly corrupt church, a young priest in Germany dared to protest. His name was Martin Luther. The reform he led would split the church into Catholics and Protestants, in the process creating a new legion of apocalyptic thinkers.
Luther set out to reform the church, to bring it back to what he saw as its proper mooring. The church, as the institutional church, saw him instead as a great threat to their income and a heretic. Luther would have just been one more reformer in a small area if it had not been for the printing press. Thanks to the printing press, Martin Luther became the bestseller throughout the empire.
Luther produced a series of pamphlets which identified the Antichrist as the Pope himself.
The Catholic Church, in effect, put out an arrest warrant on Luther, and so a number of his supporters arranged to have him kidnapped and carted off to the Wartburg Castle. There he was disguised as a knight. He grew a big beard, he gained weight, and he sat down and wrote his famous translation of the New Testament.
Luther's decision to translate the Bible into German is to make it accessible to the people. The Bible will no longer be a mysterious text that is simply interpreted through the medium of a priesthood, but each individual will become his or her own priest.
But when he got to Revelation, Luther had mixed feelings.
He actually says, my spirit can't penetrate this book. He can't make a good sense of it. Also, he thinks it's really not a central part of the Bible. He actually, in his German translation, relegates it to an appendix. But what's interesting, even though he felt that way, it's the one book that he illustrated, where he put woodcuts, because Revelation allowed him to make one of his central points, which was the papacy was the Antichrist, and the end of the world was coming. And so there you see the only woodcuts in the New Testament. You see the whore of Babylon wearing a papal crown. You see the seven-headed beast wearing a papal crown. The message was clear. You didn't have to read. The papacy, the papal church, was where Satan was working to undermine Christendom. And the fact that Satan was there meant the world was coming to an end soon.
Without meaning to, Luther had opened the floodgates to new interpretations of the book of Revelation.
Martin Luther believed that everyone would read the scripture the same way he did. And so all he had to do was make it available and people would come to the same opinion. Or if they didn't, Satan was subverting them. What he found out was that Satan was very busy because everyone who picked up the Bible and read it were going off in different directions and reaching conclusions that Luther not only disagreed with, but were convinced were the result of Satan's direct meddling.
The raw power of apocalyptic dualism was about to be unleashed again. At the cathedral in Mulhausen, a disciple of Luther's named Thomas Munzer took to the pulpit to propose his own version of the apocalypse. Even today, Munzer's message is remembered.
Luther's Reformation didn't go far enough for him. Munzer interpreted the battles and riots of the farmers as a sign from God for the last battle.
Thomas Munzer is an example of what can happen when apocalyptic scriptures become widely accessible. Munzer took the images of the apocalypse, the images of a desperate struggle between the forces of righteousness and the forces of evil, and applied it to the peasantry of Europe. Wealthy people of the day are in fact the evil ones whose destruction is foretold in the book of Revelation.
Die Zeit der Ernte ist da.
The time of harvest is here, Munzer declared.
Ich habe meine
And God himself sent me to his harvest.
Denn meine
I sharpened my sickle because my thoughts are focused on the truth.
It's not a moral reform. It's not a spiritual form. It's economic. He's worried about the poor.
gerichtet gegen alle Ungläubigen.
And the working classes, especially in the growing cities of that time, were particularly drawn to his message. This was going to be a class revolution.
On the site where Munzer would lead his apocalyptic revolution, there now stands a monument to his effort. This museum was built by Communist East Germany, especially to exhibit a diorama, the largest canvas in the world, dedicated to telling the apocalyptic visions of Thomas Munzer.
He was the local leader of the Peasants' War that actually started in 1524 in the Black Forest.
Thomas Munzer attached himself to the Peasants' War, a great mass rising of peasantry, which was in no way apocalyptically inspired. It was an absolutely straightforward peasants' revolt.
Munzer and a hand-picked army of 300 men go off to the town of Frankenhausen to join the peasants' revolt. The princes aren't going to sit around and take this. In fact, they send an army under Philip of Hesse to put down the revolt. Philip places an array of cannons on a hilltop overlooking the peasant stronghold.
The peasants are arrayed against the German princes and their army, and Thomas Munzer continues to assure them, even at the last moment, that Christ will intervene on their side.
Munzer steps forward and says, "I will catch their cannonballs in my sleeves and throw them back at them." And just at that moment, a rainbow appeared in the sky.
They're singing hymns. They literally are awaiting a glorious triumph.
As the princes load their cannons and the cavalry gets ready to charge, the peasants are singing "Come Holy Spirit," believing that this battle is the final battle of Armageddon and that God was going to break in and stop it right there.
At least 5,000 of the peasants were slaughtered in that day. Philip's army lost maybe a dozen. It was a horrendous defeat for the peasants' revolt. Munzer himself was found hiding in a cellar in the town of Frankenhausen, and eventually was caught, forced to confess his sins, and was beheaded by the princes. despite this horrible defeat that they faced, Munster's legacy is not one that disappears so easily. Later generations, particularly in Germany, would look at him as a hero, as a proletarian rebel. Marxism would come along later and think of him as a saint, as a martyr to the cause.
This East German monument remains testimony to the enduring legacy of Thomas Munster. "300 years later, Karl Marx would transform the apocalyptic ideas of Munster into a secular ideology.
The godless communism of Karl Marx has a number of apocalyptic overtones. It relies on interpretations and language from the book of Revelation in order to understand what's happening in human history.
It envisions history in terms of a series of great stages, which will culminate in a moment of crisis, leading essentially to a kind of millennium. The era of communism, when class differences and exploitation and suffering will end.
We have the words of the Internationale, the communist anthem. This is our last and final struggle. And after then, there would be no more struggles. All would be peace.
Only a century after Munster, a new apocalyptic vision of transforming society arose. Religious and secular ideas were woven together into a bold social experiment called the New World. It began with a handful of dissident Christians fleeing the oppression of the Protestant Church of England.
We will not be afraid.
The Puritans see now the possibility of literally creating, in what they saw as a new and empty world, the millennial kingdom, the vision of a truly righteous nation.
In 1630, the new governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, exhorted his fellow colonists to build the equivalent of Jerusalem in their new land.
We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us.
When the Puritans talked about founding the New Jerusalem in the American colony, they're really harking to the language of the book of Revelation. Revelation 21:10 talks about Jerusalem descending from the heavens at the end of times. They see themselves really as bringing the last days, the end of time, into reality by founding this new religious experiment.
Lo, what a glorious sight appears to our believing eyes. The earth and seas are pressed away.
The exuberance of that early experiment is recalled in psalms and hymns like New Jerusalem.
New Jerusalem, New Jerusalem, let them tell the Lord.
Cotton Mather, the most legendary in a family of preachers, helped inaugurate an era of urgent anticipation.
There are many arguments to persuade us that our glorious Lord will have an holy city in America, a city the streets whereof will be pure gold.
Cotton Mather was probably one of God's most strenuous creations. He was an energetic minister, a man who sensed that the world was constantly on the edge of some great climax. There was a sense that in a matter of months, Christ might come to earth. There might be a conflagration that burns the entire world to purify it. Cotton Mather constantly warned his parishioners about this. He spoke energetically about it, had prayer meetings, would get down before dinner every night on his knees and pray for the coming kingdom.
How long, dear Savior, of how long shall this bright hour delay?
Mather and the colonists believed that Christ would return once they had built a truly righteous kingdom. It was this sort of apocalyptic rhetoric that a generation later fueled the passions of the War of Independence from England.
This was not just a simple political dispute. This was the history of redemption in the balance, that King George was not just some sort of well-intentioned but obtuse king. King George could be seen as the Antichrist.
Paul Revere depicted events as no less than a fight against the beast of the apocalypse.
It was clear to the partisans in the Revolutionary War that events in their own day were really signaling that this was a part of prophetic plan of God, especially when they looked at something like the Stamp Act.
The Stamp Act.